Hi, my name is Boon Chu. I'm the author of the book, The Democratic Outcome State. I would like to introduce to you the notion of democratic outcomes. What are democratic outcomes, you might ask? They're simple outcomes of a competent rule. They're outcomes like safety, security, good medical infrastructure, good education, and most of all, a future for our children. You might say that the first duty of any government is to keep its citizens safe and secure. It is fundamental to any social contract that we accede to when we accede to a central governing authority. In dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese government, quite unlike all the other governments, did not have much notice. They had to deal with the rapidly spreading disease about which they knew little of. But they rallied their people. They made some early mistakes, but they also made some tough decisions, as a good government should, to protect their people. They reacted with vigor and resolve. Rallying the people, they have now recovered. Their economic activities have rebounded, and their citizens now get on normally with their daily lives. In contrast, those sharply critical of its policies are now suffering from recurring waves of the virus, with increasing levels of infections and deaths. On this crucial score, you can argue that the Chinese have lived up to their obligations in the social contract. Still, the Western liberal governments have been cynical and focused on the oppressive methods employed by a dictatorial regime, even as hundreds of thousands perish under their watch. There is nothing, it appears, that the Chinese can do to settle the suspicions and accusations that range from malicious man-made fires to draconian and unaccountable measures. For an increasing number of observers sitting by the sidelines, the dissonance of this framed narrative is beginning to jar. Pandemic controls notwithstanding, the outcomes of the Chinese rule in terms of poverty eradication, infrastructure, healthcare, and education have been unprecedented. It is time we reframe the narrative with outcomes, democratic outcomes, because the world has been led to only seeing the governments in the way liberal West has framed, i.e. an elected one versus one that is not, and by default, a dictatorship. We must now reset this narrative to embrace outcomes for citizens. Electoral democracy is not a divine inheritance. The feel-good label attached to these by those propagating is meaningless if the outcomes are dysfunction, resulting in a mortgaged future of our children, insecurity, deprivations, and social injustice. There can only be one lens with which we view governments. Are democratic governments of the world responsible and accountable? Do they improve the general welfare of its constituents? These are the outcomes that the vast majority want. Hence, the only logical question: do governments produce democratic outcomes? In the West, democracy's most seductive line calls out the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. The reality is somewhat less elegant. Men are not equal and never will be. Modern democracy's Christian Calvinist roots have translated what was an equality in the spiritual realm into equality in the ballot box, or equality in the government of man. The immediate ramification is the notion that governments magically reflect the aggregate aspiration of everyone's equal vote. But men being unequal and being differently constituted translate those same inequalities into the voting booth. So now we have the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness being hijacked by the lie of equal consent at the ballot box. The examples are many, but I'll just give a few. The NRA in the USA, TV celebrities, televangelists, powerful religious lobbies. They're just some examples. And if you throw in the potent mix of lobby groups and their money, equality of the vote is all but an illusion. Here again, the competing political model that we're seeing coming out of China did not germinate in China. It germinated in the tiny island state of Singapore. Singapore's expulsion from the Malaysian Federation set a small group of practical men towards a path of meritocracy. Now, concurrent with this tiny political and historical event, dark clouds were forming over China in 1965. Mao Zedong had retreated into Hangzhou, buffeted by criticisms from his own communist colleagues from the counter-revolutionary factions. But in July the following year, he took an unannounced dip in the Yangtze River, and when he got out, he breathed life into fanatical student support for his revolution. Untold destruction followed, denial of culture by the Chinese. Children rose against their parents, teachers, and academics. Almost everything that they stood for and had elevated to be worthy was torn down and discredited as revisionist. It would be a decade before the Chinese would awaken from that stupor. The only silver lining was the rehabilitation of a practical man in the form of Deng Xiaoping. His task was to chart a new course for 1 billion of his countrymen. Whilst the Cultural Revolution was over, Deng still had to tread carefully. The burden of ideology was still heavy, yet communism has proven to fail. More urgent was a lack of new credible ideas on how to press forward. But here is the clincher. The fluttering of the butterfly's wings, a tiny butterfly at that, did arouse a giant. History came to an inflection point in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping, a titan and a small physique, arrived in Singapore and saw what Western liberals did not. It was a practical political meritocracy after being thrown out of the Malaysian Federation, with a strong center helmed by men of integrity and capability. Importantly, like China, it was a one-party state without adversarial politics. There was no mean-spirited politics to counter one another. Yet the state delivered social justice and substantive outcomes for its people. By 1978, Singapore, under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, had progressed leaps and bounds after its precarious exit from Malaysia. But Lee was neither a communist nor a Western liberal, and that could only have reinforced Deng's innate practical streak. The implications were clear. Now, if the Chinese in Singapore could do it, being from immigrant peasant backgrounds, surely the Chinese in China could rule just as well. Well, it opened the eyes of China's most powerful man. Learn from Singapore, he would say, on return back to China. The streams of studious officials that would follow his visit into Singapore took lessons not from the infrastructure that Singapore had, but the one thing that they could see that led to Singapore's success, and that was its unique system of political meritocracy. The Chinese would later build theirs on talented people running governments based on the principles of visible merit, substantive outcomes, and social justice. From then onwards, their structured model of leadership promotion has succeeded in placing men and women in positions that deliver democratic outcomes. Now, Singapore, a small and inconvenient anomaly to many Western liberals who couldn't quite figure out what it was, could be ignored as an anomaly, but not China, with its 1.4 billion people and a government that delivers democratic outcomes. And here is the myth of liberal accountability. Accompanying Western liberal democracies is this myth that circulates that says democracy is accountable because there is adversarial checks and balances. This idea springs from a 300-year-old European theory suggesting that competing ambitions, a tussle of devil versus devil, could bring about good to society. Now, it may have been alluring in the day and age when aristocracy was powerful and the peasant masses were trying to counter the powers of the aristocracy, but unleashed in today's elections, parliaments, congresses, it presents nothing more than cynical politics aimed at winning the political competition, irrespective of the impact on the people. Mean-spirited politics played out across much, if not all, democracies, attests to how intended separation of powers have now devolved into separation of purpose. By that I mean political parties, political entities, lobby groups aren't there to check and balance. They're there for one purpose only. They're there to further their own ambition and win the ultimate prize in politics, and that is power. The logic of adversarial checks and balance is incoherent, mind-blowingly so. Think about this. How logical is it that having chosen leaders whom we are convinced exhibit traits of honesty and integrity, we would then throw them into the playing pool and corrupt them with a cynical game of competing ambitions? To be sure, China's reversion to a political meritocracy would not have needed a Singapore lesson. Singapore only re-germinated the idea that was already part of the Chinese cultural fabric that was misplaced in the throes of their cultural revolution. But Singapore and China are not the only political meritocracies. Japan, immediately after the war, until the late 1980s, were ruled by a succession of American technocrats and Japanese meritocrats. They were bureaucrats like those from the old Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, and the all-powerful Ministry of Finance. They were unelected people whose sole purpose in their vocation was to improve the lives of the Japanese people. And so were the meritocrats and bureaucrats of the South Korean military regime and the Taiwanese military regimes. They were meritocrats in military uniforms. The democratic outcomes enjoyed by the Japanese, South Koreans, and Taiwanese owe much of their origins to a time when adversarial politics was not a factor in their political landscape. The Chinese and Singaporean models are far from optimal, but the democratic outcomes brought on are historically unprecedented. Yet the common thread running through these is not cultural, just in case anyone would think that it's an East Asian phenomenon. It is logical and hence arguably universal. What applies in East Asia should apply elsewhere. There are examples of political meritocracies outside of East Asia. The decay of electoral democracy is evident the world over, yet the inexplicable defense by liberals continue on the basis that there is no better model. It is now time to call out the velvet yoke that wraps around our necks. People of the world, let us free ourselves from the chains of our own vote.